And I now call on Senator Black to conclude.
I want to start by thanking all the senators here who are supporting this legislation. I want to thank Sinn Féin, Labour and of course all the independent senators who are supporting us. But I especially want to thank Fianna Fáil. I'm very aware that Deputy Niall Collins has travelled over to Palestine. He has educated himself about this issue and he came back and was very clear about how he felt. He saw it with his own eyes, as I did. So I'm delighted to say that we now have the support of every political party in the Oireachtas, bar the government, which is I'm really sorry about that. But I remain hopeful, Taoiseach, that you will hear us out and come on board as the bill progresses. Ultimately, I'm pursuing this initiative because I want to see Ireland take a stronger lead on issues of human rights and social justice, and I don't believe such stances hinder our international standing. I believe they enhance it. And I saw the impact of settlement expansion myself. I know I spoke with you about this yesterday, Taoiseach, when I visited the West Bank earlier this year. And the restrictions on movement, the shrinking space for housing and healthcare, the chronic lack of electricity. I witnessed with my own eyes the crushing indignity of a Palestinian community cut off from their water supply so that it could be diverted instead to support an Israeli chicken farm. That is horrendous, and the injustice of it will stay with me forever. That commercial settlement built on stolen land beyond international recognised borders is a war crime, and I know I'm repeating myself today. And I'm asking my colleagues across the House today, is the moral response to simply condemn this as illegal, but then ask how much for the eggs? Is there not a deep hypocrisy in that position? We've spoken at length about the legal aspect to the whole issue and our obligations as an EU member state. In researching my speech today, I was reminded of similar debates that took place in the early 80s when courageous Dunnes Stores workers refused to sell goods from apartheid South Africa. Faced with clear injustice, they followed their conscience and changed history. But their courage was not always matched here in Leinster House. There's a great set of state papers covered in the Irish Examiner a few years back that show the opposition from government and senior officials at the time. As the Examiner reports, and I quote directly, state papers show that the Department of Foreign Affairs had no objection on political grounds to the proposals, but expressed concern that they could cause legal difficulties because of Ireland's membership of the EEC. Now, of course, the EU. In fact, the Attorney-General advised at the time that we couldn't legally ban apartheid produce unilaterally, a position that was of course later reversed. The papers are interesting because they show that even on one of the most internationally applauded stances we've ever taken, there was still an unwillingness for Ireland to be the first one to do so. We see the concern that no other EEC state had moved before us, and I quote directly from the Minister, who worried that, quote, a unilateral ban on trade with South Africa is inappropriate at present in that it would be unlikely to influence the South African government. They go on to say that the huge amount of global attention could have damaging consequences for the country's international reputation. Now, these cases are not identical, but the parallels struck me all the same. We see that same fear of taking the first step, of making a novel legal argument, of charting a course for others to follow. Ultimately, history has shown that the brave stance in favour of justice and human rights did not undermine Ireland's reputation. Instead, it greatly enhanced it. We sent a signal to our partners that tangible, credible steps could be taken that went beyond empty condemnation, and others followed. We did not isolate ourselves. We took the opportunity to lead. So we may have a long path ahead of us, but I believe that Ireland can play that role again. And I believe that when we look at how the settlement project that is crippling the West Bank, the damage on the ground and unforgivable human cost, it should summon in us the same sense of injustice and anger that compelled us to action in the 80s. Ultimately, those striking Dunnes workers forced Irish politicians to stand up and show some leadership. The same applies today. I actually met one of the original striking workers, Tommy Davis, outside Leinster House this morning, and it was inspiring to see them coming to show support for this bill. We've made the case clearly that Ireland has the legal capacity to pursue this if the political will is there. Today, I'm calling on my Oireachtas colleagues to show that it is, to state firmly that Irish foreign policy will always stand on the side of international law, human rights and justice.
Now I can call on the Minister to respond.
Thank you, Chathaoirleach. Well, first of all, can I thank everybody who's contributed to this debate, and can I thank Senator Black and the other co-sponsors of the bill for facilitating it. When we debated this issue in January, we discussed it, and it was agreed by everybody that we would extend the debate until July, before this House broke up for the summer. And so we're following through now on that commitment to conclude today. I agree with people who have said, I think it was Senator Batchik said it, that if anything, those months have reinforced the concerns that many people have and the frustrations that they have at a lack of progress in terms of the Middle East peace process. I wouldn't criticise anybody for that growing frustration and sense, as I said earlier, of helplessness, despite the fact that Irish people do feel a real sense of injustice in terms of what is happening to Palestinian communities. And I think that's very deeply held, not just within political parties, but across Ireland generally. We've had a presence in the Middle East for many years, predominantly through peacekeepers, and we continue to have a significant number today in southern Lebanon, on the Golan Heights, and indeed NGOs also working with Palestinians. And we have quite a significant programme, a humanitarian programme, that I intend on increasing significantly, and that process is already underway. But the politics of this is what we're debating today. There is no doubt that this House is a very powerful voice for the Palestinian cause. We've heard that again today, and not for the first time. The first time I visited Gaza was with Senator Norris. I remember it very well. It was a very, very emotionally charged time. The week before we arrived at the Erez crossing, there had been the first female suicide bomber had blown herself up, killed many young Israeli soldiers, and of course herself, in an act of desperation and violence. And I remember when we came back to Jerusalem, the difficulty that Senator Norris found in that his former partner had been thrown into prison. You might remember, Senator. And some of the conversations that we had were powerful ones, given Senator Norris's 40 years of experience back and forth to Israel and to occupied territories. So what I would say to Palestinians who are listening is that you have a very powerful voice in this House, in our lower house as well, across the political parties, my own included, who will continue to speak up and advocate for progress in the Middle East peace process, as will I. But what we are debating tonight is not the commitment towards changing an injustice that has sustained for far too long. What we are debating here today is how do we change it? And how does Ireland use its influence on the international stage at a UN level, at an EU level, to find a way of changing the status quo that can move towards the two-state solution that so many people are becoming increasingly sceptical about because of the expansion of settlements, particularly in the West Bank. And I think I said before when I spoke in this House that we are seeing today the pouring of concrete on land that belongs to somebody else and is subject to a negotiated solution that will result in two states, one of those states becoming increasingly unviable because of the expansion relentlessly of settlements. So let there be no doubt about our concern about that. are calling it out for what it is, which is illegal activity in an occupied land that Israel has a responsibility towards in a way that it is not following through on in a way that's consistent with international law. So the issue and the injustice, in my view, is clear. My problem is that the proposal that we are debating today and the nature of it, in my view, given the current politics of the Middle East, is unlikely to contribute to changing that in the short or medium term, unless something happens on the back of this bill being passed that I'm not expecting. And I'm honestly saying that to people, having spent a lot of time in New York, in Washington, and in the parts of the Middle East that I referred to earlier, speaking to some of the key people who have been named in this debate today, getting to know them and disagreeing with them on a lot of issues in this perspective, whether it's on the status of Jerusalem, whether it's on expanding settlements, whether it's on the need to support UNRWA financially, where millions of Palestinians are relying on that UN body for basic health care and food demands and so on. And we are working, as I say, to try to influence outcomes. And I remember very well being in New York at the UN General Assembly last September and meeting the Palestinian delegation there. Minister Maliki, who I've got to know very well and respect. And the Palestinian Prime Minister had just met the US President, and there was a sense of optimism that perhaps we were moving towards a new initiative that Palestinians could buy into, as well as Israelis buying into. And unfortunately, that optimism has disappeared in the months that followed, in particular around the context of statements that were made in relation to Jerusalem. And obviously, subsequently then, the tragedies that we've seen on the Gaza border and continuing expansion of settlements. So my point is that through that period of negativity, Ireland has been working away, trying to find ways of making things happen through persuasion, things that were not being considered a year ago that are being considered now. And it's not just about humanitarian relief, because this has to be about something bigger than that in terms of political change, but also about trying to find a way of creating a context for a new peace initiative that can potentially work. And in my view, the passing of this legislation moves us further away, not closer to the context that would allow that to happen. Because this is a divisive mechanism, and it is deliberate. And by the way, if I were to give up on persuasion and diplomacy, well then I would look at supporting actions like this if I got legal advice from the Attorney General that it was possible to do it. And I have heard your explanations in terms of the legality of the bill before us, but I am a government minister. I am the Taoiseach. I have to rely on the legal advice that the government has in the Attorney General's office, and a former Attorney General who's here will understand that. And I have very detailed advice, which was not rushed and has been checked and double-checked in relation to our capacity to support the legislation and to implement it. And I have to be guided somewhat by that. But I have to say my primary response here is one of the politics of this. Given the conversations and the meetings that I've been involved in, and the progress that we are trying to make towards an outcome that can really help Palestinians, and that can give them some hope for the future. And I will continue to pursue that, despite the expectation that this legislation will be passed through second stage today. I expect it will be. So I respect this House and its decision. I respectfully disagree with the tactic of it in the current environment, which is a very heated one in the Middle East. And I believe we are fanning those flames by doing this. as opposed to trying to ensure that Ireland can create a stronger, unified position within the European Union, and with the conversations that we have with key actors in the United States, in Ramallah and in Tel Aviv.
Minister,
So I expect that we will be back here again debating this legislation at different future stages of its consideration, and I hope that you will see developments along the lines that I am advocating for, to show that there are other ways in which we can make progress on a problem that, to be perfectly honest with you, should have been solved decades ago and has resulted in misery and death and violence and a total hopelessness, particularly in Gaza, but also amongst a new generation in the West Bank because of the inactivity of those in power to progress a peace process that I hope can find a way forward in the coming months.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes statements on Palestine.